Um, I am a public school parent and grandparent. My kids were educated mostly in public schools here in D.C. and in Chicago public schools. And they were very well educated by good teachers, many of whom were your members, I'm sure. And they went to great colleges, were extremely successful. Three of my grandchildren now go to a school I helped integrate here on Capitol Hill 40 years ago, and they're very happy there. These things have lasting effects on neighborhoods. They have lasting effects on communities. We're in the middle of an incredible transformation of the American population. Our young population is fundamentally different than our older population, and it's one of the basic problems of our politics, because the older population votes more, and the younger population, a lot of them are too young to vote and are too busy and too unconnected. But we are a society that you can see the future of our society if you live in California. California, most of the children being born are Latino. We have a four-race society. We now are getting more Asian immigration than Latino immigration. We have, in the western part of the United States, we have little more than 40% white students for the whole area from the Rocky Mountains to the Pacific Ocean. It's a four-race society, and it's extremely stratified. The opportunities are basically to whites and Asians. If we look at the high schools in California, we see in the high schools that are the top-ranked high schools, which are you really need to attend if you're going to go to the University of California or even a good California State University campus, since 2/3 of the kids have to start, by law, basically by plan, have to start out in community colleges. Those high schools have about half of the Asian students, about 1/3 of the white students, 3 or 4% of the Black and Latino students. There's a path to nowhere, and it's very systematically different. They're different in terms of what courses they offer. They're different in terms of their graduation rate. They're different in terms of their suspension rate. They're different in terms of the AP courses they offer. At UCLA, we get 120,000 almost applicants a year for our freshman class. You have to have better than an A average to have a reasonable shot of admission. And you only get that by taking a lot of AP classes. Those classes don't even exist in a lot of our segregated high poverty schools. There is a very systematically unequal educational process which gives the worst opportunities to poor Black and Latino children and the best to rich white kids and Asian kids. And it has tremendous results in terms of perpetuating the inequality of our society. We haven't talked about this issue much in our public life for a long time. The last time Congress did anything really positive about school integration was 1972. When the Nixon administration and Walter Mondale enacted the Federal Desegregation Assistance Program, which was the first big program canceled by the Reagan administration. Since then, we've invested almost nothing in making diversity work. There have been some efforts to get some money in the later part of the Obama administration, but very little has been provided. How are we going to make our society work if we don't have our schools address it? We're a very stratified society. We're very divided. We're divided in terms of residential segregation. We're extremely divided in terms of income. And we create schools that are isolated by both race, ethnicity, language, and poverty. We've recently done 12 different statewide level studies of what's happening in the recent past and looking at what could be done. Basically, every place we find either stable or increasing isolation. And we find it's almost never just isolation by race or ethnicity. It's double segregation by race, ethnicity, poverty, sometimes by language. And it relates to all kinds of other inequalities in children's lives and in communities. We find in the country thousands of suburban school districts going through racial transformation. When we did a book on this issue, we found very few places that had any conscious plan of dealing with it. They tried to ignore it. You go talk to people and say, well, if we get our test scores up, it'll work. But it doesn't work because it's linked into the housing market and it's linked to racial consciousness of all sorts, and it's not addressed in any explicit way. If you ignore segregation, segregation spreads. Resegregation spreads. Communities change, communities decline. In many sectors of suburbia now we're going through the process that big city neighborhoods went through in the 1940s, the 1950s, the 1960s. And we're not addressing it very effectively at all. Now we've known ever since, well, for many decades, that segregation produces inequality. You don't have to go back very far to the early efforts at Howard University to document this with Professor Houston going around with his camera making pictures of what the actual black schools in the South look like. They're different. They're unequal in a different way now, but they are profoundly unequal, and it doesn't take any great research to show it. If you look at what's going on in physics classes in a very poor central city school, and you look at what's going on the same day in an affluent suburban school, you think you were in a different universe. And it's not because necessarily that the central city school is spending less money, although it often is, but it's because the students aren't prepared, and the teachers lots of times are not the experienced teachers who have that expertise in the field, so forth. So all of these things line up to produce unequal outcomes. We've only had one period of really trying to work seriously on integration in our country, and that was really from the passage of the 1964 Civil Rights Act until about the second year of the Nixon administration. During that period, basically the South went from 98% segregation to become the most integrated part of the United States. The South is the only place we've ever tried this on a large scale. There were huge changes that took place, and after the changes took place, public opinion actually improved on these issues. The change came, people accepted the changes after they took place. The changes were driven by courts, especially in a couple of key decisions at the late 1960s and early 70s, and by the Johnson administration, which is the only one that really ever forcibly implemented desegregation efforts. By the middle of the 1970s, the courts were limiting desegregation in the decision in the Detroit case, and later in the 1990s, there were several cases that authorized and encouraged federal judges to dissolve the desegregation orders that existed in the country. Since that time, virtually every year, segregation has increased. There was almost no attention to Latinos at the beginning of the desegregation struggle because they were a relatively small population. Latino population was about what the what the Asian population is now. And their rights were not explicitly recognized by the Supreme Court until 2 decades after Brown versus Board of Education. And they were never enforced seriously, because when they were recognized, the Nixon administration was in power, and they systematically tried not to enforce these laws. So we have never had those issues addressed. By the middle 1980s, Latinos were as isolated as blacks, more so in some places. Huge changes took place. In California in the 1970s, the average Latino was in a 50-some% white school. They're now in a school that's about 85% non-white and very poor. What's happened is the level of poverty in our public schools has increased, is that we're finding in many of the studies we do, Black and Latino students are in schools that typically have twice as many poor kids as white or Asian students. And that's related to every kind of inequality. What we find now is that we've been through a period of more than a third of a century in which, following the Nation at Risk report of the Reagan administration, we concentrated on high-stakes accountability and on market competition to solve the problems of inequality. And we assumed that we didn't have to address race directly, or poverty directly either, that was a relic of the Great Society and that it had failed somehow. So we have been trying to do it by external pressure on schools and sanctions on schools that don't achieve. And by the time in 2015, where we adopted the ESSA legislation, almost everybody had realized that that hadn't worked. But nothing new has really replaced that as a solution. One of the things we got from No Child Left Behind was incredible documentation of the inequality of students, of schools of color and of high poverty schools. But we didn't do anything about it except to increase the pressure on those schools and sanction them and their teachers and discourage teachers and good administrators from going to those schools by blaming them for everything that had happened, not assuming that we needed to address the underlying issues. What we're seeing now is in spite of the extremely conservative period we're in right now, is more and more people around the country are noticing that all of these things relate to race. They all relate to poverty. And nobody's figured out a solution that works very well without addressing it. And that we really don't have any plan to create a society where people really understand each other and know how to work together. Now, there's lots of things that can be done, and they are being done in small bits and pieces around the country. For example, on the issue of segregation of Latinos, which is extremely serious now, and Latinos are the least successful in getting prepared for college of any of our major populations, even though they are going to be over a quarter of our students. We have these dual language immersion schools emerging. I have another grandchild who's down in Georgia, north of, in an exurb outside of Atlanta, a small semi-rural town. They have a dual language immersion program, and she has become fluent in Spanish. She just had her 9th birthday, and she's correcting her mother all the time about her Spanish grammar. But you see, these kinds of things produce integration under a positive way, because you have equal status interaction. Each child is learning each other's language. The fluency of the immigrant children is seen as an asset rather than as a deficit. And that is spreading. It's not spreading because anybody's forcing it to spread or anybody's even facilitating the spread. It's spreading because it works. It's a positive. And it does produce successful diversity. One of the things that people don't know is that even at the height of the busing conflict, which was brutal and very, very intentionally stirred up by political leaders, the people who were actually in integrated schools, both the students and the families liked it. They felt it was successful. You can see that even at the absolute peak of the Nixon attack on the court orders and so forth. But the people who hadn't been to them had believed it had been a great failure. We have lots of evidence now that school integration, especially when it's done appropriately with teachers who are trained and curriculum that's supportive and with equal treatment inside schools, is a clear benefit. And it's a benefit for all groups, because at the same time that students of color get a set of opportunities that they would otherwise not have access to, the more privileged white and Asian students get a sense of understanding of their society that is invaluable. Southern California now, more than 3/4 of the children who are growing up are not white. If you're not going to be able to understand the Latino and Asian world, if you're not going to be able to cross those black and white lines, if you're going to be a black student who's in a school that has 3 times more Latino students than black students, which is pretty typical in Southern California, not dealing with race relations is not dealing with the fundamental structure of your reality and of your future. Our schools are one of the only things that we have to begin to address this and to prepare for a different kind of future. We're doing very little to make that happen. We need to encourage educators to take some leadership in this, because politicians, particularly the politicians here, are certainly not going to do it, not in the near future. And we need to encourage others to talk about it and to realize it, and to realize that there are simple things that can be done using mostly voluntary and choice techniques that actually do produce different outcomes, and that there are some obvious things that we can do in the field of housing, for example, that would produce more schools that would have what we call natural integration. We just need to figure out that that has to be part of our goals, and to put our minds to figuring out step by step how we can begin to turn from a society that just has passively accepted the continuous expansion of something that has never worked, to begin to think about how to do something that could work and could help us become a better society.